Now, for our third topic here, we want to talk about domain controller cloning, which in this context has to do with the cloning tools baked into your different hypervisor solutions that you may be using. Cloning works in a lot of ways to accelerate the process of bringing new machines online. However, that process creates an exactly the same copy of an existing virtual machine. This process gets a lot more complicated, however, with Active Directory because of the way that the database is actually constructed. In versions of Active Directory, prior to the support for domain controller cloning, those before Windows Server 2012, attempting to do a clone of a domain controller could create a situation where you had two DCs which had two different views of the database and where its last changes had occurred. And as a consequence, you could end up with some pretty painful corruption that might occur in your database. Now, for most of us, the process of cloning an Active Directory domain controller is kind of extra effort, which might just be easier done by just simply creating another domain controller and allowing it to replicate. But if you do have the need to clone and then distribute that DC for one reason or another, you do have the flexibility now in Windows Server 2012 and R2 in order to accomplish that. Now, there are some major requirements that you have to have in order to support it. The first of which is that your hypervisor, whatever tool you use as your virtualization solution, has to support a feature called VM Generation ID. Now, one of the ways in which you can identify that is to look for in the device management console under system devices. If you look for the Microsoft Hyper-V generation counter, that may just be for the Hyper-V hypervisor, but make sure that you check first with the vendor supplying your hypervisor that they indeed support VM Generation ID, because without that, this whole cloning thing is going to end up creating the same corruption you're trying to prevent. The domain controller that you're running has to be running Windows Server 2012 or Windows Server 2012 R2. Also, and this is very important, the PDC emulator FSMO role has to be online. It also has to be running on Windows Server 2012 or R2. Now, what this means is that if you're attempting to clone the machine that is the PDC emulator, one of the first things you'll have to do is transfer that PDC emulator role off into some other machine. So don't attempt to do this if you don't have that PDC emulator on and running. This also means that if you're in an environment that only has a single domain controller, this process of cloning can be quite a bit more difficult. It may be better for you to just simply create another domain controller so that you can offload the PDC emulator and ensure that it's online before you ever start cloning anything. Now, any DC, any domain controller to be cloned, must be a member of a special group in Active Directory called Clonable Domain Controllers. And there's a little command I'll show you here in a minute that will verify that indeed that machine is part of the group. Lastly, there are a very long list of incompatible applications that, if they're installed onto the domain controller before the cloning occurs, will actually cause some other kinds of corruption that you just don't want to have. And so there's another PowerShell command, which I will also show you, that will take a look at the possible incompatible applications on that machine. You need to, prior to cloning the machine, either A, remove them, uninstall them from the machine, or B, add them to a custom DC clone allow list.xml. This file name is going to be found in C Windows NTDS, and it has to be in that location, or the entire cloning process could end up failing. So notice here that there are a whole lot of these kind of prerequisites and gotchas with cloning that you have to be careful about before you ever go through this process. Microsoft recognizes the untoward pain that can happen when you end up with any Active Directory corruption event, and so there are these purposeful tests that occur before you're ever allowed to go through any cloning activity.